Are you prepared? Are you ready for the fuckery to ensue? Because shit's going down. Shit's going down and it's horrible. I've already said that. It's not, things aren't that bad. We can do things, we can change the outcomes of certain situations. But for now, some DEI updates. Right, and let's break this one down. So Trump's big brain plan, fire every diversity and inclusion worker, put the concept of fairness on paid leave and make sure that the federal government's hiring practices are based purely on merit, which in this case seems to mean whoever Trump thinks deserves it. And if any agency tries to get clever and rename their diversity programs to hide them, snitch or else. The adverse consequences, but really gives off tell the teacher or I'll punch you energy. Undoing decades of progress. This is some next level spite. Lyndon Johnson's affirmative action order gone. Executive Order 11246, signed in 1965. It required federal contractors to hire and treat employees fairly regardless of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Why it matters? Well, it forced companies that did business with the government to actively prevent discrimination. Not just the way, not just say they were fair, but take actual steps to ensure diversity. Over time, it expanded to include gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity protections. It led to affirmative action policies in hiring, education, and federal contracts, trying to level the playing field for marginalized groups. Why Trump is killing it? The conservative argument is that affirmative action equals reverse discrimination, and that hiring should be 100% merit-based, as if bias and systemic inequality magically disappeared. This move lets companies stop actively trying to be diverse and just say we hired the best person for the job, without considering why historically some groups had fewer opportunities in the first place. Basically, Johnson's order was a proactive step towards fairness. Trump's move is like saying, nah, let's just get back to pretending everything is already fair. Minority farmers, pay equity, what of those? Any government program that even remotely tried to help historically underserved communities targeted for extinction. That includes funding for minority farmers, emergency relief for black neighborhoods, and any hiring practices that acknowledge that maybe past discrimination had some lingering effects. Nope. All of that is now woke nonsense and must be stopped immediately. Corporate America already caving because lawsuits from conservatives and a general fear of being labeled woke have companies like Walmart and Facebook already rolling back diversity efforts. Trump's move just speeds up the inevitable. Who needs a diverse workforce when you can just not have one, right? Moving on, the bureaucratic nightmare. Of course, it's not like this all happens overnight. Trump can sign a piece of paper, but actually dismantling everything takes time, lawsuits, and mountains of paperwork. And some of these policies, like giving second chances to people with criminal records, are actually Trump-era initiatives. But hey, details, right? The bottom line, the government is being ordered to pretend systemic inequality never existed. And if you point out otherwise, you're probably next on the chopping block. And if this doesn't go exactly as planned, at least Trump can blame the deep state for not canceling fairness fast enough. Next, let's see what else is getting dismantled. Alabama lawmakers have once again stepped into the spotlight with a new bill that legally defines gender based solely on biological sex at birth. The Alabama Senate passed a bill 26-5 vote, joining a growing number of Republican-led states pushing similar legislation in the wake of President Donald Trump's recent executive order rejecting gender identity and affirming the existence of only two immutable sexes. A return to the past. The legislation, which disregards contemporary medical consensus, asserts that an individual's sex is fixed at birth and determined by reproductive anatomy. Senator April Weaver, Republican sponsor of the bill, confidently cited the Book of Genesis as supporting evidence for the measure, stating, "Men are born men, women are born women, and one can never become the other." Apparently, ancient scripture has now become the gold standard for crafting modern public policy in Alabama. Why not eye for an eye? Medical professionals, however, are less enthusiastic. The American Medical Association and other respected medical organizations have long recognized that gender exists along a spectrum and that rigid binary definitions exclude intersex individuals and those who do not conform to traditional gender norms. Despite such warnings, the bill's proponents argue that the legislation is necessary to protect women-only spaces such as bathrooms, locker rooms, and sports teams. For Alabama's transgender community, the bill is more than an abstract policy debate. It is a direct threat to their safety and well-being. Transgender individuals have expressed concerns about the practical impact of the law. For instance, trans men with masculine features, such as beards and deep voices, would be forced to use women's restrooms, increasing the risk of confusion, harassment, and potential violence. Micah Saunders, a transgender man from Birmingham, testified during a public hearing that the bill creates more problems than it solves. The bill will put Alabamians under the threat of violence and harassment. It solves no problems and creates new ones, Saunders said. Alabama is not alone in its efforts to legislate gender identity out of existence. Similar bills have been introduced or passed in states like Wyoming, Nebraska, and Missouri. In Nebraska, State Senator Kathleen Koth cited Trump's executive order as providing a framework for states to act without fear of federal reprisals. Trump's order not only dismisses gender identity, but also directs federal agencies to rescind diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, including gender-affirming care for transgender individuals. The Alabama bill is part of a broader conservative movement to roll back transgender rights nationwide. Advocates argue that these laws are necessary to protect women and children, for critics see them as a transparent effort to marginalize transgender individuals under the guise of protecting women's spaces. Public backlash and protest. The bill's passage has sparked outrage among transgender individuals and their allies. Hundreds of protesters marched to the Alabama state capitol, chanting slogans like "We deserve to be here." T.C. Caldwell, one of the protest leaders, declared, "I'm tired of running from the opposition. I'm not going any damn where." Opponents of the bill argue that it is part of a larger campaign to dehumanize transgender people and strip them of their rights. Democratic Senator Linda Coleman Madison criticized the measure, warning that it could lead to increased violence against transgender individuals. "I believe people are going to be killed and die behind this," she said during a Senate debate. Should Governor Kay Ivey sign the bill into law, as she has promised, Alabama will face potential legal challenges. Civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Lambda Legal have already signed their intent to challenge the measure in court, arguing that it violates the constitutional rights of transgender individuals. The practical implementation of the law could also create confusion and unintended consequences. For example, the bill does not address the logistics of enforcing gender-based restroom use or the potential backlash against cisgender women who may be mistakenly targeted for not appearing feminine enough. Okay, guys, I need to add a little bit of historical context to what we are talking about in regards to transgender rights being, well, blatantly just thrown out the window. Not that transgender people have it easier right now, but it got significantly worse ever since Trump took office. And the thing is that this is not the first time that transgender rights are being revoked, and they are treated like they never existed, they never belonged on this planet, or they're just some... I frankly don't understand the rhetoric behind everything that's going on in regards to transgender people. They are just people like everybody else. What they have in their pants and passports is none of your fucking business, to be honest, in my opinion at least. And if white cis men would start focusing more on how to fix the problem of poverty and support families who can't afford to live, instead of just constantly fixating on what other people have in their pants, maybe the world would be just a little bit a better place than it is now. Because shit's broke, y'all. In 1919, in Berlin, Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, a pioneering German physician and sexologist, founder of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, so Institute for Sexual Research, conducted groundbreaking research on sexuality and gender identity, including work with transgender individuals long before the term was even coined. Obviously, if he pioneered research as early as the 1920s in Germany, we should have heard about it or had some kind of information in regards. Herr Hirschfeld, unfortunately, in 1933, you know how everyone knows that Nazis burned books, famously burned books. The first public book burning was at this institute and at the Institut für die Sexualwissenschaft. It happened over there, on his research, on his library, on his books, on everything that he managed to establish. Everything was wiped away, wiped clean. LGBTQIA plus people were the first minority to be the center of attack for Nazi Germans and the Nazi Party, but they certainly were not the last, because other minorities, famously Jews, Romani people, but also black people, were in Germany too. In the early 20th century, many black people coming from Africa or America came to Germany, and they were also targeted by the Nazi Party. So if you imagine what is going on right now in the United States with revoking human rights when it comes to gender affirming care, with all this nonsense stating that there are only two sexes and that it's binary. It's not binary. You can find this information everywhere, that gender is more easily understood when you see it as a spectrum. Just like sexuality, just like the expression of gender, okay, of your gender identity, when it's not just two opposing points. But if you think of it, this is something I've seen somewhere. I don't remember where. I don't want to lie. But I've seen this somewhere. And it completely changed the way how I perceive gender identity and sexuality, if we combine all those things, but instead of putting it on the x-axis, okay, so straight, gay, this is an oversimplification, but you get my point. Instead of drawing a line, we can do this in 3 dimensions. You can have sexuality in terms of being attracted to someone. So from being attracted to the opposite expression to the same expression, right? We can do this in terms of my identity. So the second axis would be my identity, how I identify myself, whether I am more as a man or a woman. So we have now 2 axes, but we can add a 3rd dimension. We can add depth to it if you think of how it is being expressed. Because you can be, let's say, a man who is attracted to other men, but feels, identifies somewhere in between a man and a woman, but the expression is more towards, let's say, masculine features. Why am I doing this to myself? Why am I jumping into too many topics all at once, all at the same time? Why the fuck am I doing this to myself? Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld was a victim of persecution against LGBTQIA people in 1930s Germany, the culmination of which was completely closing down his institute, burning all of his research, setting us decades back, because what he was doing was groundbreaking given the time during which it was happening. And now what is happening in America, where transgender people's rights are being just stripped away, because if you are being forced to, from a legal perspective, from the state's perspective, as either being male or female, you are being stripped of the right to exist. This will not change the fact that transgender people exist. It will make their lives a living hell. You have seen the research. Everything I found, I am linking below, so you can check that out for yourselves, including a separate article on the methodology of the research that was being done, trying to estimate how much of the American society is transgender. And the research that I found, and I'm citing here, has a cap of 2016. I think, yeah, it was 2016, that's the cap. And by that time, 1 in 250 people identified as transgender. That was many years ago. And the numbers right now are higher, but not because suddenly transgender people started popping out of existence. No, it's just they started to feel, I'm guessing, more comfortable with coming out and identifying as transgender. Alabama's move is just one part of a larger conservative agenda influenced by Trump's federal directives. The former president's executive order calls for gender identity to be erased from federal documents, passports, and prisons. The federal stance has emboldened state lawmakers to pursue similar policies, even as courts weigh the legality of such measures. Ultimately, Alabama's new gender definition bill reflects an ongoing cultural and political battle over identity, science, and civil rights. While its supporters claim to defend tradition and safety, its critics see it as a dangerous regression that prioritizes ideology over reality, with vulnerable communities caught in the crossfire. On his first day back in office, former President Donald Trump signed an executive order redefining sex within the federal government as strictly male or female, a move with potentially sweeping consequences for transgender individuals across the United States. The order mandates that official documents, including passports and federal policies such as prison assignments, adhere to his binary classification. While implementation is not immediate, the directive sets the stage for significant changes in the federal policy and has sparked intense debate among medical professionals, legal experts, and transgender advocacy groups. Defining male and female, biology or ideology. The executive order asserts that sex is determined by reproductive cells present at conception, large cells, eggs, or females, large cells, eggs for females, and small cells, sperm, for males. However, biologists have pointed out that the fundamental flaw in this definition, noting that these cells do not exist at conception. Carl Bergstrom, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Washington, explained sexual differentiation has not started to take place at conception. The definition in this order is scientifically incoherent. The order disregards the medical consensus that sex and gender are more accurately understood as spectrum, with intersex individuals and gender-diverse populations falling outside rigid binary classifications. The American Medical Association and other health organizations have criticized the directive for ignoring decades of scientific research. Implementation: a long road ahead. Despite the high-profile signing, most provisions of the order remain inactive. Heron Greenswich, Deputy Director of Policy at the Transgender Law Center, emphasized that nothing is in effect without further federal action. Agencies have 120 days to report their compliance plans, while Congress awaits a draft bill to codify the definitions into law. Legal experts predict a protracted battle over the order's legality. This order doesn't change current law, said Omar Gonzalez-Pagan of Lambda Legal. It signals the administration's stance, but court challenges will inevitably follow. Passports and identification. One immediate effect of the order is the elimination of the X-gender marker on passports introduced in 2021, after years of advocacy by intersex activists. The State Department has already removed online resources that explained how to change one's gender marker. While existing passports remain valid until expiration, applicants seeking renewals must comply with the binary classification. Federal prisons: a return to unsafe practices. The order instructs the Bureau of Prisons to house transgender women in men's prisons and hold gender-affirming medical care, including hormone therapy and surgeries. Human rights advocates warn that this policy could endanger transgender inmates who already face disproportionate levels of violence in prison settings. Sarah Werbelow, legal director of the Human Rights Campaign, pointed out that existing court orders granting gender-affirming care remain valid. However, reports have emerged of transgender inmates being moved to isolation in anticipation of transfers. Medicaid and healthcare uncertainty. Medicaid coverage for gender-affirming care varies by state, but Trump's order raises questions about future eligibility. The Biden administration had introduced rules to extend coverage nationwide, though those changes remain tied up in court. Lindsay Dawson, LGBTQ health policy director at KFF, cautioned that revoking existing coverage would require a lengthy regulatory process likely to trigger additional litigation. A deepening divide. Critics argue that an executive order is less about administrative clarity and more about political posturing. This isn't about science or safety, said Greensmith. It's about erasing transgender people from public life. Look, I need to address a few more things. Do people really lack basic empathy towards other human beings who are struggling? Imagine you are trapped in a cage, but you can't escape the cage, and you live like that for years on end. And you have the chance, you have the opportunity to get out of that cage, to change and be who you know you are and who you know you are meant to be. Look, transgender people were always there. Always. Just like any other LGBTQIA plus people. We were here always. Yes, we, because I identify as a bisexual. I am part of that community. I have a right to be here. I have a right to exist. I have a right to live. Have the civil courage that if you don't like other people, to say it out loud. Instead of hiding behind some book someone wrote thousands of years ago. As a matter of fact, biblical studies show that that book has been reinterpreted and mistranslated and appropriated. Everything in the Bible is an appropriation of some other story that was there before it. Biblical studies say so. It's all made up. This is my opinion, of course. You have a right to believe in that book of yours, if you like. But it's an appropriation of previous books. The Abrahamic God is an appropriation of a Canaanite deity. This is all appropriation. That's a story for a completely different time. If you've been with me till the end of this episode, thank you. I very much appreciate you. Stick around, because it gets worse. Cheers.